Calling the dead. In 1969, Carl Uphoff, a rock musician from New Jersey, received a phone call from his grandmother. From this phone call, in her life, the grandmother had a strong relationship with Carl, and she cared for him so much that she used to call his friends if he was late for the house, and because she was deaf, she was content to leave a small message for Carl with whom she called from his friends, which was, "Tell him to come." As for Carl's friends, they were always complaining about the grandmother's calls, and they asked Carl not to give her their phone numbers. It took a long time when the grandmother did not call, so Carl thought that he would not hear her voice again, but he was wrong. One night while he was sitting with his friends in the basement of a friend's apartment in Montclair, New Jersey, his friend's mom came over and said someone was waiting for Carl on the phone. When Carl goes upstairs, he finds himself talking to an old woman who he immediately realizes was his grandmother. Before he could ask her how to call him, the line was cut off. The grandmother called several times after that, and every time he asked her how to call, she used to end the call until she stopped after a while. Nevertheless, Carl was sure of her presence around him and he felt that she was always watching him. Another chilling phone call from beyond the grave took place in Wilmslow, Cheshire in 1977, when a young woman named Mary Meredith received a call at her home from her cousin, Shirley, from Manchester. Mary shuddered when she heard Shirley's voice, because she had received another phone call from her aunt telling her of Shirley's tragic death in a car accident just an hour earlier. Again, before the caller could be questioned, he hung up. In 1995, on a radio station in Liverpool appeared a medium named James Byrne, who claimed to be able to transmit messages from the other world, and was a very popular guest. One of the listeners tried hard to reach Mr. James to call her grandfather, who died a year ago, but unfortunately she was unable to call because of the large number of callers and the busy line. On Sunday, she was sitting listening to the program at about 10 o'clock in the evening. Her phone rang when she picked up the phone to her ear. She heard his voice. It was her deceased grandfather. He said to her, "Everything is fine here. I am with your grandmother and my friends. Take care of yourself and do not cling to the past, but rather walk forward to go now. Goodbye." Wilson did not believe herself. She stood near the phone trembling and did not say a word. After that, she woke up from her shock, wanted to know if it was a joke from someone, so she dialed the number 1471 to find out the phone number from which the last call came, but she was shocked when she heard the automated answering service dictating her phone numbers. How was the call from her phone into her phone as well? Then the lady was convinced Wilson that her grandfather called her from his grave. In 2011, a paranormal investigator from Danville, Pennsylvania, receives a letter from a man who wants to search his house because there have been several paranormal activities that indicate the presence of ghosts. The caller introduced himself only as George, without titles, then left a different phone number than the one he called. The investigator asked for the phone number that George left, when a woman answered him, so he asked her if he could talk to George. After a long moment of silence, the woman replied saying that George was killed in a fire inside his home 10 years ago. When the investigator asked her about the phone number from which George called, she told him that this number belonged to George before his death. Done. A face under the snow. Just 1 week before Christmas Eve, Mary decides to go into the nearby woods on a snowy afternoon to gather some sprigs to decorate the Allen family home. The boy Edgar accompanied her and somehow they managed to get out unnoticed. The two children were gathering ivy branches and pine cones which Mary was putting in her basket, but during the outing a strange accident occurred. When arrows drawn in the snow caught Mary's eye, arrows appeared one after the other before Edgar and Mary's eyes. At the end of her umbrella, Mary wrote the phrase, "Who are you?" The unknown archer answered her in a strange way, crossing out her question with 3 lines. Out of curiosity, the two children walked behind the arrows that continued to appear until Mary found herself standing above a frozen lake in which the snow was very thin and began to crack under her feet. Edgar grabbed Mary's arm and then pulled her away from the lake. Then they heard the voice of an old woman cursing them, but they did not see her. They returned home and told Mary's 17-year-old sister, Isabel, who ran out to check the arrows and saw that they were already there, so she followed them, as did the two children until she reached the lake, when she retreated, and she was afraid, and said that she saw under the thin layer of ice the face of a child. Isabel sent the servant to ask for help. The police later discovered that the child under the ice was Carol McLean, 6 years old, the daughter of one of the farmers and that went missing days ago. Edgar's father, John Allen, saw that the spirit of the old witch, Nellie, drew arrows on the ice to lure the two children. That witch, who was killed by the villagers by drowning her in the lake on charges of sorcery 100 years ago, was avenging herself by luring children into the frozen lake in the winter and their drowning, It is worth noting that 9 children had drowned in the lake since then. By the way, the boy, Edgar, grew up to become the most famous horror writer of all time, Edgar Allan Poe. Graveyard Girl. One day in the year 1990 at 4 o'clock in the morning, Alan, 24, was returning home almost drunk after a night out with friends in a Liverpool pub. He was walking by Sefton General Hospital when he noticed a presence. A girl standing on the sidewalk outside the hospital near the bus station. The girl was about 20 years old, blonde, wearing a short dress and high-heeled shoes, standing shivering from the cold, waiting for a car. Alan approached her and spoke to her. "You're not a doll, right?" Alan joked, trying to start talking to her. "I'm dead from the cold," she said while smiling. When he saw how big and loose his jacket was on the girl's body, then he continued talking. "Waiting for a taxi?" "No, waiting for my friend," said the girl, then looked at the road. "It's bad luck. You're waiting for someone else, then. I think he won't come, even if I waited for him for years." "He does this a lot," she said sadly. "What does he do so much?" "He says he'll come pick me up and then he doesn't show up. I think you should look for a friend other than him." "No, I love Tony so much, but does he love you?" Alan asked her. "Most likely he will not come. I wonder if something happened to him." "No, maybe he's with a girl." The girl didn't say a word and it seems she decided to go back on foot. Alan walked with her while looking at her legs. She was really beautiful and sexy. Alan asked her, "What's your name?" "Judy," said the girl. "Hi Judy, it's Alan." Judy smiled and continued walking. Before she bowed her head down and covered her face with her hands as if she was about to scream, she ran to the cemetery. Alan thought she was either sick from drinking or just wanted to relieve herself. Alan stood waiting for her and after about 10 minutes, he yelled into the dark cemetery, "Judy! Judy, are you okay?" Then he crept among the tombstones, looking for them. There was no trace of the girl's presence. He expected to find her on the ground because a lot of drinking, perhaps, except that she did not seem drunk to him, and in the simple light of the sun that was about to rise, he saw the girl, or so he thought. He shouted to her, "Judy, are you okay? I am worried about you." It wasn't Judy, but his jeans were covering a gravestone, and then again he saw Judy's face. Picture of Judy to be exact. Beneath it was an inscription that read, "Born in 1970, died tragically in 1990, the day she died just 6 months earlier." Alan was horrified. He ran out of the cemetery and did not stop until he reached the doorstep of his house. He fell from exhaustion, panting and trembling, and trying hard to open the door. A week later, Alan told 2 of his close friends the story of Judy. Then, Brian, Alan's friend, said that his sister was a friend of Judy. Then he told her sad story, saying that Judy was on a date to meet her boyfriend near a bus stop at Sefton General Hospital, but something tragic happened. Judy had a hole in her heart that no one knew about until she collapsed while standing at a bus stop. People tried to help her and take her to the hospital, but she was already dead. When her friend found out about her death, he swore never to pass on the road that Judy died near. The next night Alan and his classmate Brian went to Judy's grave and put a bouquet of carnations on it, as Brian's sister said carnations were Judy's favorite. While the boys were walking away from the graveyard, Alan took one last look at the grave when he saw Judy waving at him. What Judy still appears on the road to drivers who pass in front of the bus stop near the hospital late. Maureen, who returned from the dead, during the month of May 1866, a cholera epidemic struck the city of Liverpool, claiming hundreds of lives, who had recently settled in Everton. After her death, Maureen was placed in a coffin, and according to the Irish custom, the coffin was placed in the house open in a room that received those who attended the funeral, although the authorities opposed this matter because they did not like the idea of the presence of the body of a person who died of cholera, but the family forced the authorities to back down. He continued this was the situation for several days, during which banquets, drinking sessions, and lamentations were held near the corpse. One evening, everyone left the house at about 7 o'clock, heading to a tavern on Great Homer Street. While the 19-year-old daughter of George Allen's, father of the deceased girl, Shannon, who was spending several days with her uncle, volunteered to stay at home. At 8 o'clock on the same night, that is, 1 hour after everyone had left, Richard O'Hare, an old friend of George Allen's, came to visit him and was unaware of the death of his daughter Maureen, whom he had not seen since she was a child. Richard knocked on the door several times without receiving an answer, but before he left, a window opened upstairs with a loud whistling. A young girl looked out of the window with a smile on her face. Richard asked her, "Is this George Allen's house?" "Yes, but they all just went to a tavern on Great Homer Street." Richard thanked her and left. He arrived at the tavern and found his friend George and his family drinking. He sat with them and asked each other about his condition. Upon asking George, his eyes filled with tears as he told his friend that he had lost his daughter. Richard embraced his friend, and after a while they left the tavern heading home. They knocked on the door for a long time, as Richard did, but his niece, Shannon, did not answer. Her uncle muttered angrily, "This girl is useless." Then Richard objected to his friend, stressing that Shannon appeared from the window upstairs with her jet black hair and helped him a while ago when she showed him on Tavern Road. George shook his head denying, saying, "You must have missed the house, because Shannon is a redhead." But Richard insisted on his words and pointed to the window from which the girl appeared. While George was searching for the keys in his pocket, Shannon arrived, accompanied by a young man from the neighborhood, who left after seeing George. And he was angry and shouted, "Shannon, where were you?" The girl answered him that she was sending a letter to her father. George pointed to his friend saying, "Here is Shannon." Richard marveled and said that the girl he met was completely different from this one. George began to get angry with a friend who made things worse rather. When he rushed to the upper floor after opening the door of the house, everyone rushed behind him, running to find Richard on the floor unconscious in Maureen's room and next to her coffin. George and his sons carried Richard and took him out of the room until he almost threw him out of the house from the severity anger, but his wife prevented him from doing so. Mrs. Allen said to her husband, "Richard seems to me honest. He was not aware of Maureen's death, nor did he know exactly where her room was located and what it looked like. He had not seen her since she was a child, and if not honestly, if he had pulled back the curtains and opened the window that I had closed myself before we left, would you, Shannon?" Shannon said, "No, I didn't enter the room after you left." George didn't believe what his wife was saying, even after Richard woke up and swore to him that it was Maureen who looked at him from the window. An unforgettable night. I worked for a very short period as a security man in a juvenile prison, and the reason for it being a short period is what happened to me on the first night shift. The walls, but I did not pay any attention to the matter at first, believing that they were attempts to tamper with the new employee only, nothing else. At least, this belief did not last for long. On the same night that I heard the stories, I went down, as required of me, to the underground floor to take an inspection look. I went down, I saw my shadow that decided not to accompany me. I stood on the stairs for a few seconds. I watched my shadow continue its way down while I was standing still. I stayed in my place while I watched him walking attached to the wall. I followed him, but he had disappeared in the darkness of the basement. After a few steps inside the place, I started to hear the sound of footsteps accompanied by the groaning of a person in pain. I thought he was one of the prisoners, so I searched for him everywhere until I found my colleague in the shift tonight. I do not know where he came from, but he said to me, "Why are you so afraid? Did you see the shadow that inhabits the place here?" Yes, I saw him and also heard the voice of one of them here and there. I am looking for him. Yes, I also heard him. I think he is coming from the warehouse. Let's check him out. My colleague came in front of me, then entered the warehouse and shouted at me from there. I found him. I stood outside the warehouse trying to open the door that was closed after my colleague entered. I do not know how, but I did not succeed in opening it. I asked my colleague to try to open it from the inside, but he also failed. Then he asked me to go to the guard room upstairs to find something to open the door. I left him and ran quickly into the room thinking about how he would spend these minutes alone in that scary place, but when I arrived, I found him sitting there. On the bench listening to the radio, I asked him, how did he manage to get out of the warehouse? Then he answered me, "Which warehouse?" And when he went down there, "It's your turn to check the basement." I didn't say a word, and in the morning, without mentioning the reason to anyone, I left work in prison and I didn't tell this story before this time. It's over. A true story reveals to you that reality is more terrifying than all horror movies. We do not deny that movies can be very scary at times, but you can at least console yourself by being just movies that have no connection to reality. Even those movies whose events are based on real stories, they usually do not enjoy accuracy and credibility. Which means that there is no need to worry about it. As for what is really worth worrying about, it is what is happening on the ground, such as the stories and frightening situations that have already occurred and we cannot escape from them, which have outperformed the strongest horror films, crime and mystery. And here are the strangest and most terrifying real-life events. Mysterious. One Lincoln had a dream before April 15, 1865, that is, only 3 days before President Lincoln's assassination. And as soon as I put my head on the pillow, I fell into a deep sleep, and because I was bored, the dream soon began in which I was asleep, and I suddenly woke up, although the place around me was very quiet, until the silence was interrupted by the sound of sighs, as if a large number of people were crying. I left my bed and I went downstairs to see where these voices were coming from. The sounds of wailing and bitter survival remained loud around me, and I searched in all rooms for those who were crying, but I did not find anyone. I moved from one room to another looking for them. The place was familiar to me. I was surprised and worried after I realized that I in the White House. What could all this mean? I kept looking everywhere for the owners of the voice until I reached the eastern room. There I found a coffin in front of me with a body wrapped in funeral clothes, and around the coffin there were soldiers standing as if they were guards, and there was a crowd of people staring sadly at the corpse whose face was covered, and others were crying. Who died in the White House? The Masked Man. In 1669, King Louis XIV sent an unknown man to prison without trial and forced him to wear a hideous mask made of whale bones to never take it off. In fact, until now, no one knew what the man did to deserve such a strange punishment, but not this. It is the biggest mystery, but rather the identity of this man is the puzzle here, as King Louis is the only one who knew who this man was, and with the death of the king, he died with him, solving the mystery. This man was called the Man with the Iron Mask, and he was imprisoned in several prisons. One of the most famous of these prisons is the Bastille and Fort Pignerol, known today as Penrolo. He was detained with the jailer, Benin Dauphin Saint-Mars, for 34 years until he died on November 19, 1703 under the pseudonym Marcioli. Borders because of his unknown face and unknown name. One of the French writers came up with a strange and very logical idea from his point of view, which was exploited in the movie, The Man with the Iron Mask, where this writer mentioned that the prisoner is the twin brother of the king, Louis XIV, but the idea did not gain the approval of historians. In front of this story, the films of murderers and kidnappers are very trivial, as unlike them, they are 100% realistic. 3. The Unknown Thief. In Japan, a man noticed that someone was stealing his food and using his tools, and he was not present in the house in which he was living alone, so this man decided to install a surveillance camera, believing that someone was breaking into his apartment after he left, but he was surprised after seeing the film that the camera filmed a few days later. A girl appears in the movie who comes out of the closet every day to eat, bathe, relieve herself, and behave in the house as she pleases. Shortly before his return, she returns to the closet again. Later on, the man discovers that the girl has been living in his closet for more than a year. 4. I Will Die. SS Orange is a Dutch cargo ship that sank off the Indonesian shores in mysterious circumstances when it left China for Costa Rica in 1947 in the month of June in particular. That the ship's crew had died, and when the American ship arrived at the scene, they found all of the crew and workers, as well as the dogs, had died. Their eyes were all open and staring at the sky, and the effects of fear and panic were drawn on their faces. Moments later, the fire broke out, and the crew members of the American ship had to get away from it as soon as possible, which exploded moments later and disappeared at the bottom of the water. It is reported that the last phrase heard in the distress call was, "I will die." Then the transmission was cut off. 5. The doll was killed by the child, Jane, after the death of some of her companions in a residence in New York. In a suspicious way, the police tried to interview Jane and investigate her. According to reports, the girl went insane and accused her doll, Missy, of committing the murders, before she threw the doll out of the window of her apartment while she yells, "Bad doll. Naughty doll." After this incident, Jane's condition was diagnosed as suffering from hysteria. She was placed in a sanatorium and did not leave until after her death, an old woman, in 1968. 6. Her husband is in the refrigerator. In 2011, the Indonesian police arrested a 29-year-old woman on charges of eating cannibal. After her arrest, she confessed to killing and eating up to 30 girls, along with her husband. The police also found large quantities of human flesh stored in the refrigerator. The woman also admitted that she cooked human flesh for her friends and relatives at dinner parties held at her house. Then she blamed it on her inner desires. In killing and eating people, she would do it again if given the chance. 7. Maria and Delfina follow in the footsteps of Ria and Sakina, a small gang consisting of Maria and her sister Delfina Gonzalez, another version of Ria and Sakina. After the prostitution business stopped, this small gang resorted to killing to save the price of drugs. When the police arrested the 2 suspects, and after searching their house, the police found 91 bodies, of which 80 were women, and the rest were the bodies of men who were killed in order to seize their money. Maria and her sister Delfina were sentenced in 1964 to 40 years in prison. 8. Unidentified corpse bodies are discovered every day and almost everywhere, but few of these corpses may be as interesting as the unidentified corpse later known as Somerton. On December 1, 1948, a Caucasian man in his mid-40s was found dead on Somerton Beach in Australia. Forensic medicine was unable to establish the cause of death. A year later, a bag belonging to the dead man was found in the locker of the train station. The bag did not reveal any information about its owner, but rather complicated things. Another piece of evidence that added to the mystery of the case is a small piece of paper found inside a secret pocket in the corpse's pants. The piece of paper was a piece of the first edition of Rubaiyat al-Qayyam, and on it was written a Persian word meaning, finished. For more excitement, it was found in after examining the rest of the book in an unknown car. He suggested that it was the car of the unknown dead person. In this book, he wrote 4 lines of mysterious codes that have not yet been solved. This issue is still a puzzle that is difficult to solve. 9. A letter from a dead person. In 1885, a man received a postal message from his brother. In the letter, it was stated that this brother of his was mentally ill, but he was cured and will come soon to visit him. The strange thing is that his brother who sent the letter died 13 years before the date of sending this letter. Immediately, the man took out his brother's coffin, and when they opened it, they did not find anything inside it that was empty. 10. A novel come true. In 1838, writer Edgar Allan Poe released his novel, The Tale of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. And in the 2nd and 3rd chapters of the novel, it was stated that the whaling ship that the protagonist sailed on was exposed to harsh climatic conditions while it was at sea, and with the loss of the ship, the food ran out, which prompted the 3 sailors to eat the body of their friend in order not to die of hunger. At the time when Poe wrote this novel, he did not know that it would be realized on the ground after years. In the year 1884, 3 sailors got lost in the sea with their small boat after their ships sank, so they were forced to eat their friend, and it is said that this man was called Richard Parker, and that it is the same name that the man bore who was devoured in Poe's novel. 11. One leg is enough. When George Boyer was a boy, he didn't want to be an athlete or a rock star when he grew up. But instead he aspired to be on one leg. Years later, Boyer shot himself in the leg. Although the doctors in the hospital told him that the leg was not badly damaged, Boyer convinced them that he wanted to amputate it, regardless of its condition. Indeed, the doctors carried out his wish and amputated it, and Boyer lived happily with one leg for the rest of his life. 12. Two-Face. Edward Mordache has 2 real faces, one on the side. The front like all humans and another in the back. Edward was born in the 19th century of the English nobility and is the sole heir to the English peerage, a hereditary title in the United Kingdom, from which the ranks of the British peerage are formed. He is also a young musician with outstanding talent and was characterized by sharp intelligence, but he was isolated from social life by people, and refused to allow anyone to visit him, even from his close family, because Edward has another face in addition to his normal face, and it is the face of another man at the back of his head. The doctor who was supervising his treatment describes it as the face of an ugly man. As for Edward, he used to say that it was the face of a demon. He was that extra face at the back of Edward's head as a clever and funny face. The face used to laugh when Edward cried, and the eyes of this face followed Edward's visitors, and the lips moved without making any sound. No one could hear the sound it made except Edward, who was saying, "I swear to you, that face keeps me from sleeping, for that devil is a talkative devil whispering all night long." And Edward called that whisper a devil's whisper, and it was a continuous whisper that never stopped. One of the people can believe the words that this face used to repeat to me constantly: "I was created in this way because of a mistake that my ancestors committed, and I do not know what this mistake is." Edward was begging his doctor to destroy this face of his head even if this destruction led to his death, and despite the great care given to him by his family and his private doctor, Edward poisoned himself when he was 23 years old, and left a message asking his private doctor to destroy the evil face before being buried, and he says in his message, "I do not want to live with this devil in my grave as he lived with me in my life." 12. The killer number. Finally, there are films that talked about fatal messages and phone calls, but they remain just films, but in reality it happened. Something similar, over the last 10 years, all the people who got 0888-888-888 as their phone number were killed one by one. Scary laughs. I am a 43-year-old woman, which means that I am too old to make up stories in order to gain admiration or attract attention, and this is my story. I live with my husband in a large family house of 3 floors located in a village. We moved to this house recently, but my husband's family lived in it for years. I remember that I felt uncomfortable when I saw the house the first time, perhaps because the house is strange to me. This is what I thought at the beginning, until we moved to live in it. Then the matter changed from mere feeling of distress to death. Out of terror, a month after I moved into the house, I was sitting watching TV with my family in a room on the first floor located next to the stairs, and by chance the movie we were watching was a horror movie. To sleep, but I stayed to arrange the room, and it was about 2:30 in the morning. During that, I heard a faint laughter. I was shocked, but I was not afraid. The matter was repeated 3 times, and the sound was of a little girl and it came from the top of the stairs. I stayed in my place until the sound was repeated for the 4th time. Then I decided to check from the matter. I climbed the stairs, and I did not find anything again. I heard a voice, but this time it was the sound of crying coming from the kitchen below. Of course, I went down there, and as usual, I did not find anyone. I only found the tap open, closed it, and rushed to my room, and I was about to die of fear. I lay in bed and tried hard to sleep, but to no avail. I stayed awake and was afraid, not only of what happened to me downstairs, but because I felt that night that someone was watching me, but in the end I fell asleep until I felt someone feel my whole body. I opened my eyes to find a black shadow in front of me. I did not see any features except red eyes staring at me, and he was smiling at me, my husband, who told me that he did not see or hear anything, and how would he do if the black shadow disappeared at the same moment he woke up. About 2 years and 5 months after that night, my husband's family traveled to attend a relative's wedding in another country, and my husband and I remained only at home. As last time, we stayed watching TV until late at night. Suddenly my husband asked me, "Did you hear this?" But I didn't hear anything. Almost from the kitchen, but there was a sound of crying. He asked me to stay in the room, and he would go to check the upper floor in the kitchen. Minutes later, he came back quickly and told me, "Come on, put on anything, and we will leave the house immediately." Indeed, we left the house and went to Ibn's house, his uncle who was very close to our house. Before we reached his cousin's house, I asked him what he saw, and he told me, "When I went upstairs, I found a girl laughing and playing with a man when they felt my presence by looking at me." We returned home 2 days after that incident, and my husband's family had also returned. Years passed during which we did not see anything frightening, perhaps because I made sure that no one was left alone in that house. Now my children have grown up, although I did not tell them what happened. I and their father are with me, except that my daughter told me one day that she saw several times in her dreams a black shadow and red eyes watching her.